Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today we're back with part three of our epic six-part discussion of Marvel's classic Star Wars series. I'm joined once again by the Confessor, who is an expert on Marvel's Star Wars series. In the first two episodes, we covered issues 1 through 38. This time around, we're going to start with issue 39, and we're going to have a bunch of cool stuff in this episode. We're going to discuss the Empire Strikes Back adaptation. We'll get into the beginning of the Walt Simonson run on the book. And so there's a lot of cool stuff to look forward to. Can't wait to hear what you think of this. As always, I want to remind you that this is audio only. Since we weren't recording the video when we did this podcast, but there's a lot of cool stuff. So I hope you enjoy Star Wars as much as we do. And let's just jump right into it.
It's interesting. I know you mentioned that you have quite a bit you want to say about The Empire Strikes Back adaptation. I got to be honest, I don't really have many notes on it. I mean, the art's fantastic. It's incredible. It's possible I just didn't give it as close a reading as I should have. Compared to the adaptation of the first movie, I didn't notice as many major deviations from what you see on the screen in this adaptation.
I would agree with that too. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that it's closer. However, there are some fairly major things that are included in the adaptation that were left on the cutting room floor, such as when they're when they're on Hoth at the beginning in the base, you have this whole subplot about these Wampa creatures that are loose inside the base. Which was in the shooting script, but and actually in the adaptation, that they were absolutely right to cut that from the film, but in the adaptation, the comic adaptation, actually that works quite well because that's basically dealt with in the very first issue, and it just gives a really nice sort of kind of almost like a subplot, but like a sort of a subplot source of kind of menace, if you like, while the story's gathering pace, because it's not really until the Empire get to Hoth, and you've got the Atat walkers and stuff like that's obviously really action packed, and but the sort of first part of the film, other than the sort of peril of Luke being lost and Han has to find him and stuff like that. Actually, in the comic, it works well because it gives that extra layer of there are monsters loose inside the rebel base. It's just an extra sort of thing, which I think works well. But yeah, the thing with me, I mean, I loved that adaptation. I had a hardback annual that was given to me for the sort of Christmas 1980 or whatever. And I just, that was really my first sort of introduction to Al Williamson's art. And of course, it's really nice. It's very photorealistic, but it's also it's very comic booky. That's the great thing about his art, that it doesn't sacrifice any of that sort of comic bookiness. For want of a better word, for a start, the actors looked, the characters looked like the actors. So, Princess Leia looked like Princess Leia. Harrison, the Han Solo looked like Harrison Ford. It was that sort of thing. And of course, you've got all that lovely. There's so much detail in his panels as well. You sort of read it, and obviously you're focusing on the foreground, but then there's all this luscious sort of detail. And that really, really comes into its own a bit later on when you get to Dagobah, and it's the sort of tangled vines and kind of swamp ecosystem. And it really looks like a sort of a living, breathing ecosystem. And I, even as a kid, I'd read that annually, which was just the adaptation in its entirety. I'd read it over and over again. And I'd love to sort of look at the panels and sort of think, oh, I wonder what's just behind that boulder, just around the corner from that it made you want to jump into the artwork and actually explore. It looked so, a Dagobah really looked like like a living, breathing, alien ecosystem, and that's
I think it's interesting with the Star Wars adaptation, they did it as the comic book first, and then they collected it. Whereas with this one, they did it the other way around. They published this oversized, actually a couple of different formats, if I understand correctly, like an oversized
in the States. Yeah,
in
that's
the
right.
States.
Yeah.
And then they serialized it. And when they did that, they were able to make corrections to the artwork based on what the movie actually looked like compared to their working script. I think the main change was the appearance of Yoda, if I remember correctly.
That's right. It was the very first published sort of version of it, if you like, was the a little tiny paperback book, and it was called something like the Marvel Comics Illustrated Edition of The Empire Strikes Back, or something like that. And that was the one that had the sort of purpley white-haired Yoda, which very much looks like the very early Ralph McQuarrie production paintings. They also released it as like a treasury sized a thing, and also as a magazine, I think, before it was actually serialized in the regular thing. But all of the other versions in the state had the right redrawn Yoda, the one that actually looked like the Frank Oz puppet. It was only that very first paperback book that actually sort of had it. But in the UK, it was really weird, because in the UK they in the comic, the weekly comic, they reprinted the sort of improved doctored version with the correct looking version of Yoda. But when they collected it as an annual, it was it was like the earlier version. I mean, interestingly, there were things like the space slug, the big space slug in the asteroid field.
Yes.
Uh, they weren't allowed to show that, so you just get, because Lucasfilm insisted that they didn't do that.
But Lucasfilm must have been really happy with Williamson's lush pencils, especially compared with Infantino.
That is what Archie Goodwin told Al Williamson. When they began work on The Empire Strikes Back, which was, I guess, mid 1979, he told him that Lucas really was not a fan of Infantino's artwork on the series, and did not, under any circumstances, want him to be drawing the long-awaited Star Wars sequel.
Well, it's interesting. A couple things. The adaptation ran in the regular Star Wars series for 6 issues, from 39 up through 44. It's
Mhm.
not long after the end of this that we see the departure both of Carmen Infantino and Archie Goodwin.
But also, I think what's interesting as well is that straight afterwards, the first, I don't know how many off the top of my head, I think there's something like 3 or 4 standalone issues that are Archie Goodwin or certainly are Infantino drawing, and they're much better. They're some of the best sort of Infantino art of the run. And Louise Jones, the editor, came on board, and she had this real thing that, like, okay, from now on, we've really got to make a real effort to try to make the Star Wars comic look like the Star Wars films. And I think that was because of the adaptation, and because I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that that Al Williamson's art in that adaptation really pushed the comic to sort of new heights that then other artists that came afterwards had to step up to.
Yeah. So let's talk about those issues right afterwards. So issue 45 is Death Probe.
Oh yeah.
To me, this was an okay story. It didn't really stand out to me. It seemed kind of like similar to issue 38, which came just before, where it was sort of a one-off. It didn't really necessarily feel that connected to the rest of events. I thought it was okay, but
Actually, I have to say, I think it's a really great standalone issue. There's some really nice attention to detail. That you have things in it with Luke sort of saying, about his cybernetic hand and stuff like that. So it carries on nicely. Obviously, there's a probe droid, but this is like a probe droid on steroids kind of thing. So it's like they've taken one of the new pieces of technology that we've seen in the recent sequel in The Empire Strikes Back, and they're running with that straight off the bat. But also the mood of it. I think what's really interesting about that, the very first issue after The Empire Strikes Back, it's much darker. And even like there's a level of violence in it that is just slightly more mature than what had come before, and it really seemed like the comic sort of shifted tone slightly to reflect that sort of darker mood of.
well, I guess for me it was overshadowed a little by issue 46, which is I think a pretty well-known issue, Cody Sunchild.
The Dreams of Cody Sunchild. Written by J.M. DeMatteis, although he changed his name on he called himself Wally Lumbago, I think. Again, what's really interesting about that is that the main thing you have to understand about the Dreams of Cody Sunchild was that it was quite a personal story for J.M. DeMatteis, because he just had a son, and the son's name was Cody, so it's like, it was a son, child, and in the original ending, he wrote this ending where Cody, who was this great warrior who'd become like a sort of pacifist, he's tempted to return to his old sort of violent ways, but crucially he decides it's better to allow himself to be killed, to die for sort of like a dream of peace. However, when that was submitted to Lucasfilm, the people at Lucasfilm were like, no, 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 no. This is no good. If they have him taking the higher moral ground, becoming, makes our characters look bad. So they forced him to change it, and I think that in the retooled sort of ending, Lando explains, that was a very honourable thing for Cody to do, but Cody was wrong. He sacrificed himself for a dream, but actually, such ideals, if you like, aren't really enough, or aren't really sort of realistic when you're dealing with something as evil as the anyway.
Right, and so DeMatteis, he ended up as you mentioned, he took his name off of it because he was ticked off.
Yeah, that ticks off. But what's interesting is that the art must have shipped to the UK because we got the original ending. Not only did we get the original ending, but it also it was credited to DeMatteis. It was, and I actually emailed him. And actually, somebody had got there before me and had sort of clued him into it. But I mean, for decades, he had no idea that it had been published anywhere else in the world in its original form. So yeah, he was very happy about that. But it's an interesting issue, just forgetting all the controversy about it and stuff like that. It's an interesting issue because I think we were talking about this before, that it's obviously they really run with what is a really new character, Lando Calrissian, and they have him as the star of the book, sort of almost straight off the bat,
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting when they pick it up pretty much right where Empire leaves off, where it's Lando and Chewie are in the Millennium Falcon. They're searching for Han Solo.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned before, it really struck me as something where if you had been reading this as you were as a kid, it would make Lando a much bigger character than for people who weren't reading the comic and only were just going off of the movies.
That's right. And I'd not really thought of that before, but I think you're absolutely right. Like when I saw Return of the Jedi and Lando's there, it's like that was a really well-known character to me. But I guess you're right. To other people who maybe weren't reading it, they'd only seen him for about 10 minutes at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. He was still a pretty, unknown or a very new, sort of unfleshed out sort of character. But to me, he was completely three-dimensional. And that was, again, I think this is one of the things that the comic did at its best. It supplemented the movies and explored characters that perhaps the movies just didn't have time to.
So there are a couple other things in this issue that I found interesting. One is just the story. To me, it struck me as a very classic sort of sci-fi story of about non-involvement. Like in the Black Hawk podcast I did, there was an issue of Black Hawk with a similar plot line where there's a group of these people that have decided to stay out of World War II and not get involved because they have this sort of peace agenda. And basically in that story, Blackhawk convinces them that it's similar to what Lando says at the end of this issue. He convinces them that this idea of peace is kind of a pipe dream. They have to fight for what's right and stuff. The other thing that struck me here was Cody Sunchild himself. As I mentioned previously, I was noticing when going through this a theme of a lot of one-off Jedi characters where we have characters like Cody who are actually Jedi, or characters who think they're Jedi and may or may not be, like Don Juan Quixote. We're going to see another stand-in for Jedi Knights in issue 49. We get a number of these characters who sort of it feels to me in a lot of these where the writers want to work with the Jedi, but they're very constrained by Lucas in what they can actually do. So they either use stand-ins, or in this case, they have someone who's only in there for one issue and then they get rid of them so they don't have to actually deal with the Jedi stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I would just say I don't think Cody Sunchild is a Jedi. I think he just was a great warrior from the sort of time of the Clone Wars. I don't think he's actually ever referred to as a Jedi. I mean, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think he is anyway. But he's this great warrior that Lando idolized as a child. Heard stories about and that kind of thing. And of course, as you were saying, that he, at the end, it's like Lando realizes that it's a bit of a pipe dream. But of course, that's not the ending that as it was originally intended. The idea originally was, and I think right at the very end, there's a different sort of thing as well, where Lando just goes off and leaves the Imperials. But in the retooled ending, he goes off and purposely leaves them trapped to rot in this dimension. It's kind of cold in a way, But
so after that, issue 47, it's another interesting one. It's another one-shot. But it returns to this theme that Goodwin has of these anti-droid prejudice and sort of brings that out to the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you've got this whole, and again, we see this sort of that prejudice also crosses over to cyborgs, because Cligson, who is this guy, the cyborg who sort of runs this space station populated by droids, the sort of droid world of the title of the comic. He's decided to turn his back on the rest of the galaxy for that and surround himself with mechanicals. That's droid world is always one of those issues that for me has always been a bit kind of like meh. Even when I first read it at the time.
As you were saying, like it wasn't an issue that really jumped out to me as being particularly good. It was just more thematically interesting because this is something that Goodwin just keeps coming back to.
It's interesting comic in terms of, R2 and 3PO are the heroes. It basically follows them. I think that's interesting, and a little bit of a different, a little bit of change of a pace, whatever. But it's never been an issue that I've loved. It's always just sort of, yeah, it's all right.
So in issue 48, we get another spotlight issue. It is interesting, coming right out of Empire Strikes Back, we get not just a series of one-shots, but they're one-shots that focus on different characters. So 45 was Luke Skywalker, 46 was Lando and Chewie, 47 is R2-D2 and C-3PO, 48 we get a Princess Leia spotlight issue, written by Larry Hama, where she faces off against Vader in a very unusual way, where they're scheming against each other on this planet, but not exactly outright fighting. They're just sort of trying to outthink each other.
Yeah, it's a deeply flawed issue, I think. Again, it's one of those ones that's never really been one of my favorites. It's a mess, it is just a mess. I think, the good things are that there's lots of plot twists. I like the sort of intrigue of it. It's a very diplomatic story, isn't it? There's lots of sort of diplomacy and sort of subterfuge and that kind of thing, because obviously on this planet Argao, I think it's pronounced Argao, they have it's like a sort of a banking planet, isn't it? And they're not allowed to have any weapons, so you have this thing where they've got to face off, but they're not allowed to sort of. That's the thing with me anyway. There's lots of little things like that. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like, she's got the jewels of Alderaan or whatever with her, hasn't she, on the planet? I seem to remember. And you just think, well, surely they would have been with the royal family of Alderaan at the time when the planet was destroyed, wouldn't they? Why would Leia have them? She was in, and I know that maybe that's nitpicky, but the other thing is that this is the first time that she's come face to face with Vader since Han Solo, her lover, that she's had this kind of on-off relationship with, and it's finally in The Empire Strikes Back has become this thing where they've actually kissed, and she's admitted to herself as much as anybody that she's in love with. This is the guy that essentially put him in carbonite and almost killed him, and they're face to face, and that's not addressed in any way, and that doesn't sit well with me either. That's like, you'd think she'd be really angry, and she isn't.
I agree. I feel like I like this story, except for it doesn't make any sense with these characters. I feel like it's a good story for other characters. If there was a different bad guy in it, like, it's interesting to see her and Vader trying to outsmart each other. But my note for this was that it's an interesting story. I like the twist ending where it turns out that Vader wins, even though you think that Leia's won. However, it just didn't feel like Darth Vader at all. Like, Darth Vader's, to me, is not like, a sneaky schemer. That's not really his personality. So the way he operates in this issue, where he's also deferring to the bank. And I'm like, that's not the Vader that took over Cloud City at Bespin. This is a totally different guy who doesn't want to insult his hosts because he's trying to impress them. He needs them. And that doesn't feel like Vader at all. Vader, to me, feels like he's going to go in there, and if they don't do what he says, they're all going to be dead in 5 minutes.
I agree.
If it's this kind of mission, you don't send Vader.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think the character of Viscount Tardy is, for some reason, to me, that's a very memorable character. It's just a bit of a mess. It's not that it's really all that bad. It's just that it doesn't make a lot of sense. And maybe you're right, with different characters, it could have been a much better story,
So another interesting thing here is, starting with the next issue 49, no more Carmen Infantino. He's gone. I mean, I know we've talked a lot about Infantino's artwork and, how much everybody hates it. It's a
Some
little.
people love it though, don't they?
He leaves an interesting legacy on this book, as we talked about earlier. I think his
Mm,
main legacy is driving away millions of potential readers, starting with issue 49, where we get the team of Walt Simonson on pencils and Tom Palmer on the finishes, and
dream team.
everything looks much, much more Star Wars all of a sudden.
It does. It does. I don't really like that issue. I think it's really, really flawed, but it's a real fan favorite. I remember when I did my reviews and I was like, I kind of was quite brutal about it, really. And people were like, oh my God, this is like a great issue. How can you not like this? But again, I just think it's very, very flawed. The art is superb. The art looks amazing. It's, as you say, you've got this Jedi or wants to be a Jedi. His name's Jedediah for a start. Now, right off the book, it's like so there's a Jedi called Jedediah. I mean, that's to me that's just it's just rubbish.
We got Don Juan Quixote and
Well, even that's
Jedediah.
better. At least that's got some kind of wit to it or something, This is just what?
Well, it's just, see, he's a Jedi and he dies. It's Jedediah. It makes so much sense.
Yeah, brilliant. That's some top drawer writing there. No, I even at the time, I just thought, what? I think he's a really interesting character design. I like the sort of look at it. One of the main things with this is that Luke is an utter dick in that issue. Because Jedediah is this, wannabe Jedi. He's also brain damaged, okay, because he's in this crash that they've had.
He's clearly not right in the head. He's received some sort of brain damage from that. And yet, despite that fact, Luke, being his petulant self, gets all in a bunch because he feels like this guy is disrespecting the great Jedi legacy. And that's kind of hilarious when you think about it, because what does Luke know about the Jedi legacy at this point? Pretty much nothing. I also know that the other thing that really bothered you with this issue was the way Leia was once again kind of acting out a character where she sort of falls for this random prince guy.
It doesn't make much sense. She basically forgets all about Han for this dashing prince, like almost overnight. And I think she's even considering marrying him, isn't she? I mean, I'm a little bit hazy on this, but
yeah,
it's a mess.
I think you're right about this being done. It should be pointed out. This is another one-off story, but it's not written by Archie Goodwin like the previous issue 48. This was written by a fill-in writer. In this case, it's Mike W. Barr, and I think some of the characterization issues in both 48 and 49 with Leia can be chalked up to not just this not being the regular writer, but I have a suspicion that some of these were written around the same time that Archie Goodwin was working on the adaptation in order to give him some breathing room to do that.
As well, in these sort of early, post Empire Strikes Back issues, there is a glaring continuity problem. Well, in fact, it's not even in the early issues. It goes all the way through. That Luke has a lightsaber with him. He has a blue lightsaber in all of these issues, like in Death Probe, in this one, and all the way through the run. And of course, he lost it at Bespin Cloud City. So there's this recurring, continuity issue essentially, which I'm sure is just because Marvel wanted him to have his lightsaber, because that's his quintessential weapon, isn't it? Yeah, I can't believe that's a mistake. To me, that must be an intentional thing that they've decided. Well, look, Luke has lost his lightsaber in The Empire Strikes Back, but we can't have 3 years of him, without his signature weapon, because if you take that away, then you're not going to see any lightsabers in the comic for 3 years, So I think they just sort of thought, oh, well, nobody will notice. And actually, as a kid, it didn't even cross my mind. I have to be honest. It's only later that you suddenly think, hang on a minute, maybe they just had an old blue lightsaber hanging around the river base or something. I don't know.
So with issue 50, we get an interesting story that is also important because it's the last issue of Archie Goodwin. I was about to say the last regular issue, but as we've seen, we've had multiple fill-ins here. So even going as far back as issue 38 before the Empire Strikes Back adaptation, this last year or so of his run has been really broken up by a lot of fill-ins. So it's almost like he's filling in again on his own run to close things out with issue 50, where we get this special extra large story with a flashback to Han Solo. I thought reading this that we were going to be getting a lot more of this. I was like, okay, here's how they're going to keep Han in the story for the next 2.5 years. Is they're going to have a bunch of flashback stories with Han, but we don't really end up getting that many of them.
No. And again, I think that this is one of the things, for me, the strongest period of the comic is between those two movies. It's between Empire and Return of the Jedi, and they did really well to churn out some really good stories with one of the main three cast members basically entirely absent. And arguably, he's the most interesting character as well.
The flashback sequences in issue 50 were actually written for pizzazz. They were much older in terms of when they were created.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They were done, I think, sort of, I don't know, like 78 or something like that. Whenever pizzazz would have been cancelled, they were for that. But the thing about the Crimson Forever, this 50th anniversary, is that it's fantastic. I mean, it's a great comic. It's one of the best comics. It's got Al Williamson again on art with Walt Simonson doing some of the later stuff. But it feels like sort of like episode 5.5. It sort of feels like a missing. It could be a movie. It could be an adaptation of a movie that is between Empire and Return of the Jedi. There's that lovely painted cover to it, which I think sort of adds to that. It's almost like a sort of an unused movie poster. That's the thing I've always thought.
And it's also interesting. It sort of wraps up some of Archie Goodwin's longer arcs because it brings the Tage, the Tags, the Tags,
whoever they are,
the Tage family. Yeah, whoever they are, they're back, and this is more or less the last time we see them.
No, I think this is it. I think this is the last sort of mention and the last time we see any of the Tage or the Tag family or whatever they're called. I love the way at the end as well that it's sort of left open. It's like, I think, like, is it Lando tells the bounty hunters, because she's with like IG-88 and Dengar, and he tells them, oh, by the way, there should be a hefty price on her head, and then sends them off. And it's like, well, what happened to her? Did they turn on her? Did she manage to, is she still out there somewhere? Did they kill her? Bring up, it's left open, but of course they never return to it.
I think they do some good work with Lando in some of these stories where we see the differences between Lando as a character and Han as a character, because they theoretically fill a very similar role. They're both sort of the roguish, smugglers, but they have very different styles. And I think this is a really good instance of Lando doing something in a Lando way that is not the way Han would have handled it.
I think you're right, and I think even earlier on than this, with the Dreams of Cody Sunchild, right off the bat, I think they really nailed who Lando was and what his character was. It would have been very easy for them to just write him as another, a Han Mark II, and they don't, and rightly so, because he isn't. So yeah, they very, very quickly got a handle on his, the subtle difference between his character and say Han's. And
so after this issue, starting with issue 51, we get a two-parter by writer David Micheline. This is his first arc, and he's going to become the regular writer, and I think for a lot of people, they consider him to be the best Star Wars writer.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I would, Joe Duff is pretty good.
Well, there's really only three, I would say there's only three main writers. It's interesting because we're about to see in the next arc, not to jump ahead, we're going to see a two-part fill-in by Chris Claremont, and he sort of sniffs around the edge. He does a lot of, little annuals and fill-ins and stuff, but he never, I don't know if he just didn't have the time because he was doing X-Men or what, but he's there's the clear, Goodwin, Micheline, and Joe Duffy, those are the three writers for really the whole run, but there's all these people that do little one-shot fill-ins, and Claremont did quite a number of them.
Yeah, a good sort of half a dozen maybe, including some of the the UK ones, because he did the World of Fire that we were talking about earlier and stuff like that.
So for issues 51 and 52, we get this two-parter by David Micheline, which I think sort of show the strengths of his run even before he's really gotten into it. First of all, we get this story which is very similar. He's got this super weapon similar to the Death Star. It's called the Tarkin, after Grand Moff Tarkin. And so you feel that it's very rooted in Star Wars. Of all the writers, to me, Micheline's feels the most like Star Wars. He's drawing a lot of plot elements out of the movies and continuing them into his stories. The other thing in here that I really liked, and I really wanted to see more of this because I thought it was going to become an ongoing subplot, is that there's this group of Imperial officers who are secretly plotting against Vader because they're like, Vader is dragging us all down with him and he's just a dangerous loose cannon. We need to get rid of Vader. I was really hoping that was going to become an ongoing subplot because I found it really interesting.
Yeah, great. That's a really great subplot. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying about Michelini. He really hits the ground running here with this. So much so, in fact, his original idea was for this was for them to build a second Death Star, which, of course, is completely preempting the events of Return of the Jedi by around 2 years. And of course, he submits this script with like, yeah, the Empire are building this new Death Star, and of course the people at Lucasfilm are like, what? No, whoa, you can't do this, you can't do this. Yeah, and they basically put a stop to it. They couldn't explain why.
It's an interference by Lucasfilms that is understandable to a degree that some of their other interferences, especially later on in the series, just start to seem pretty inexplicable. But this one makes perfect sense.
Yeah, of course it does. Absolutely. And yeah, I think that is testament to how well he understood, Michelini. Simonson as well, he again is drawing the art very faithfully. It looks like a Star Wars movie. You can almost hear like the Star Wars music swelling as you read it.
But unfortunately, with that subplot of the Imperial officers plotting against Vader, we don't really see that picked up. That's going to be a little bit of a complaint that I have throughout Michelini's run, where he has a lot of good ideas that I thought were setting things up. And partially because he isn't on the book for that long, a lot of those ideas end up kind of not developing.
I guess you could be right. I mean, it's sort of hard for me to really sort of comment in some ways because to me, it was wrapped up in terms of it's wrapped up in the next issue. And
they almost take Vader out. But he uses the Force to keep himself from getting shot out the airlock.
That's it.
And then when the door closes, you get this shot of like the officer who did it sort of look on his face like, well, I'm fucked.
Yeah, that's right. And doesn't he then use the Force to compel him to walk out of the airlock himself or whatever?
I did think when reading that sequence that Vader using the Force to keep himself from being killed by the vacuum of space was similar in a much less goofy way to in the Last Jedi movie where Princess Leia turned into Space Mary Poppins. And
yeah, one of the most, I laughed out loud when I saw that in the cinema. And
whereas in this scene, when Vader uses it to keep from getting killed by the airlock, it's like there's a power to that sequence, and it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is Simonson's art. It's fantastic. But again, straight off the bat in that first issue, he has Luke doing the Jedi mind trick. He writes in the franchise kind of catchphrase of "I've got a bad feeling about this," and he really gets it right off the bat. Michelini. The other thing I like about his run, and I think you get to see that even this early on, is that he's very, very good at giving rebel foot soldiers and Imperial foot soldiers personalities. You get a recurring thing in his run is that you get these little asides where people that you don't even know their name, they're really little bit part background characters, and he gives them bits of dialogue, and he sort of tries to show you what it's like for the people in the rebellion or the people in the Empire that aren't the main stars, that are just the foot soldiers. And as a kid, even reading it, I really appreciated that. It made even stormtroopers, I think I'm right in saying he's the first person in the comic series, in the Marvel series, to show them without their helmets on. So it instantly humanizes them. You can see that they are just men in armor.
He really does a lot with other people in the Empire. I felt like during the Goodwin run, they were really hamstrung because they couldn't use Vader much, and so he had the Tages. I think I nailed the pronunciation on that. I felt like there was a villain problem during most of Goodwin's runs. Michelini has other members of the Empire that menace them in different ways from the way Vader does. Before Michelini has a chance to really get into stuff, though, we are interrupted right away with a two-part fill-in story by Chris Claremont with a very strange mix of artists, because the penciler is listed as both Infantino and Simonson, so I don't know if Infantino, there might have been again more of the old work being reused here and I just didn't notice it, or he was maybe doing layouts. I'm not quite sure what was going on with the art
Well,
here.
this was an unused John Carter Warlord of
Ha
Mars
ha ha.
script.
See, it's funny you should say that because I have in my notes here Star Wars meets John Carter. This feels like an intentional mashup. I did not know that that was actually
No,
an
it,
inventory
it was
story. Okay.
it was exactly that. It was an inventory story. I think what was going on at Marvel at the time, from what I've read, a lot of books were slipping behind. There was a bit of a thing going on in sort of 81 into 82 where books were sort of coming out late, and the powers that be at Marvel, it was decided that they would try and clear out the inventory. And apparently this happened in lots of different titles. In Star Wars, what happened was they had a couple of, or I don't know, like some old Infantino art for John, an unused issue of John Carter, Warlord of Mars, and they just decided to basically turn it into a Star Wars story. But what's really interesting is because, as you say, Simonson's also credited as the artist. The framing sequence where Leia is brought along to, she crashes on this planet. That's all drawn by Simonson, but it really, really looks like Carmine Infantino. And so what you've got is like Walt Simonson doing his best to draw like Carmine Infantino.
Which is a strange idea. The idea that Walt Simonson, who is like the savior of the comic in terms of the art, is intentionally making his artwork look like Carmine Infantino is kind of mind-blowing to me that anyone would allow that to happen at this point.
But I guess, you know, he has to sort of try and make it sort of join on to this thing, because once Leia is down at the on the planet's surface, it very, very clearly is, Infantino, and it very, very clearly is a John Carter story.
Oh yeah, it jumped right out. Even though I didn't know that was the case, I was like, what
Yeah,
comic am I reading? What the hell is happening here?
yeah, that's right. We know they're given different names. Obviously, it's not Deja Thoris and all of that. And that's also why, there's those, which as a kid, I loved, but there's those giant stormtroopers in this, and that's because they were,
Tharks, yeah, I think that's what they're.
yeah, they were Tharks, and it was, and Simonson redrew them.
It's really interesting just how obvious this how obvious this is that it was originally a John Carter story. But one reason I think I didn't realize it was actually a John Carter story is one thing I think we see, and we're going to see more of this coming up shortly, is a lot of times when we have fill-in issues, they feel like less like Star Wars stories, but they're stories from different genres, fantasy, sci-fi, crime, whatever, that have just been given like a Star Wars coat of paint. We'll talk about this more like when we get to Annual 2. The only note I have for Annual 2, which we'll get to in a little while, is that it's basically a Conan story. It's just set in the Star Wars universe. And I feel like we see that a lot with fill-in issues where someone's telling the story that isn't necessarily part of the Star Wars universe, but they just give it a little coat of paint and like, yeah, Star Wars, sure.
That's interesting. I mean, with this, I think this holds up really, considering what a mishmash of styles it is. And certainly on the second issue, you can very much more see, okay, that's Walt Simonson doing the art now. I think it's an interesting look at Leia and how she still carries these demons about the destruction of her homeworld, which anybody would. I mean, if you try to put yourself in that position and imagine everything that you'd known. I mean, the Earth was destroyed and everything you knew and everybody you loved was gone just like that, in the blink of an eye. That would obviously, I mean, you'd have massive sort of post-traumatic stress, really. And what we do get to see in this is that a little bit.
You're right. Considering what this two-parter is, it does a pretty good job. But issue 55 for me is where Michelini's run really takes off. Starting with 55, we start getting some elements that are going to carry through, not just through the rest of his run, but some of them are going to continue to be important for the rest of the whole series.
Yeah, that's right.
We get
Pliff,
this thing where it's Pliff, yeah. One thing that comes up constantly right from the beginning, I think with issue 7, where after the end of the first movie is the rebels are constantly looking for a new base. There are so many stories in the series where at the beginning of the issue they're like, we've got to find a new base. Let's see what's on this planet. And then they discover whatever the story is for that issue. Well, they're still searching for a new base in issue 55. And they encounter on the planet that they visit this race called the Hujib. And the Hujib are these sort of intergalactic telepathic bunnies who are also energy vampires. So they can drain the energy out of technology to feed off of. But they're actually very sort of benevolent, and they end up becoming allies for the rebels.
Pliff's the leader.
Pliff is the leader, right, of the Hujibs.
Right. I love the Hujibs, and I love them right off the bat. Again, I read online a lot, people really being disparaging about them. I think, if you're one of those people that didn't like the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi, you're definitely not going to like the Hujibs sort of thing. I like both. I think they're very Star Warsy things. Again, I just wanted to make a note of Michelini right off the bat here. Opening splash page of this issue, he's basically got speeder bikes. He's way ahead of the curve here. He's like, it's like land speeder motorbikes, way before we saw anything like that in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, he was way ahead of the curve. The other thing that I really liked in this issue, besides the introduction of the Hujibs, which I personally am a fan of the Hujibs. They were a major part of the storyline when I started reading in the Joe Duffy era with issue 95. Right. But also, when I saw Return of the Jedi, I was 10 years old, and people can have whatever revisionist history they want, but as a 10-year-old, I loved the Ewoks, and the kids liked Ewoks. Now, I understand for people that were like 15 when the first Star Wars came out, maybe they were too old for the Ewoks by the time the Return of the Jedi came out. But for my money, I loved the Ewoks. All the kids my age I knew, we all loved the Ewoks. So
they are a quintessentially Star Wars thing, and the Hujibs are the same.
Strangely enough, I felt like Michelini didn't actually use them enough for my taste in the initial run, but they get a lot of play later on during the Joe Duffy era.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. But this is, again, really, this is like a sort of a done in one issue as well, isn't it? But it's obviously tied into, the ongoing.
It's a done in one, but I feel like it's set up a lot of things.
Yes.
My notes here, I felt reading this that I was like, here's a writer that has plans for this series. Like, this is setting up stuff that he's going to pay off. He knows where he's going. And the thing that he set up here that I really liked, and we get an immediate payoff in the next 2-part arc, is Lando goes back to the Cloud City because he's like, I have loose ends that I need to tie up. I left my people to fend for themselves. I need to go back to Cloud City. I really liked that a lot. And
yeah.
I liked the
and the way it's all deserted, and which it would be because he told everyone to evacuate, didn't he? And it's like a ghost town. And that's kind of creepy as well, and I like that a lot. Sort of creepy Cloud City is that's a good aesthetic,
Yeah, I really liked the 2-parter in issues 56 and 57 where Orlando goes back to Cloud City. There were a couple things that I thought were a little strange, like Lobot has telekinesis. Maybe that was established at some point, but I don't remember Lobot having telekinesis, but he has it in this story.
There is no, sort of canonical evidence for that in the films or anything. But anyway, something I will just make note of in this thing as well is I loved that they had the Ugnaughts in it. They're kind of a bit goofy, and like you've got the Ugonaut film crew, and stuff like that. It's kind of a bit goofy, but I really appreciated and still do the fact that they brought the Ugonauts into it.
The other major thing that happens in this 2-part storyline, separate from what's going on with Lando, is we get the introduction of a new character named, I'm sure everyone's got their own pronunciation of all these Star Wars names that never appeared in films, but I'm going to go with Shira Bree.
Yeah, Shira, I think I say, but yeah, Shira. Yes, great character. Absolutely great character. This again, we're sort of again, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we're not that far off from the whole Pariah arc, and it's very skillfully done the way that they set Shira up to be this sort of a really great pilot in and of herself, and it's nice to have somebody other than Princess Leia who's a strong female character in the thing, in the rebellion and in the comic.
Yeah, so for those who haven't read these, Shira Bree, she's another X-Wing pilot and she's sort of introduced as this sidekick's not the word, sort of she goes on missions with Luke, and there's definitely, she's got like a lot of confidence. There's definitely some flirtation going on, and it leads into the next story, as you were saying, the Pariah arc. From issues 58 to 63, we get this big storyline with Luke and Shira, and to me, this arc feels like the centerpiece of the Michelini run, and one could argue that this is the most important and maybe the best story in the whole series.
Yeah, for my money, in terms of original Marvel originated stuff, the Pariah arc is the best. Just before we talk about that, we should just mention that in the issues before that, I think it's in 59, where that's sort of almost like a little bit of a prelude to the sort of Pariah arc proper, because that's where Lando and Luke Skywalker go and get these TIE fighters. The Rebel Alliance gets like a little squadron of TIE fighters that they can use to infiltrate
the Empire's base.
Yeah, that's right. Which I thought was a great idea, and still do. I think that it makes a lot of sense. They buy these TIE fighters on the black market, and they can use them to infiltrate like Imperial armadas and stuff like that. And of course, that's crucial to the whole sort of Pariah thing, the whole Pariah arc, with the apparent death of Shira Bree at the hands of Luke Skywalker.
Yeah, so for those who haven't read it, basically what happens is they're having this attack. They're attacking, and the Empire uses this thing that scrambles their communication. So Luke, of course, I'm reading this and I'm like, Luke, why don't you tap into the Force, man? But of course he does tap into the Force, and he can tell someone's about to attack him. The Force tells him it's an enemy, so he shoots them down. It turns out that it's actually Shira Bree's ship. And so he suddenly starts questioning everything he knows. He's like, why did the Force, maybe I'm not as good with the Force as I thought. Maybe the Force doesn't work the way I thought, and maybe, whatever. And meanwhile, everyone else is questioning Luke. The rest of the people in the rebellion basically turn on Luke, and he becomes a pariah. And so he leaves to sort of try and clear his name. And what eventually happens is he discovers that the reason the Force told him to shoot is that Shira was actually an Empire spy that had infiltrated the rebellion with the goal of destroying Luke. But Vader didn't want him to die, because Vader still wants to get him as an apprentice. So he wanted Shira to basically destroy Luke's reputation, so he would drive him out of the rebellion and into Vader's arms.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And yeah, the whole thing about the pariah thing is that very skillfully, Micheline in the build up to that has made sure that we, the reader, know that not only is Shira really good, a great pilot in her own right, not only is she sort of, a bit of a burgeoning love interest for Luke, and he clearly has some kind of interest in her romantically, which of course adds to the angst when he then finds out that he's, killed her or shot her down, and as far as we know, she's dead at this point. But also that it very skillfully has been set up that she's hugely popular within the rebellion at large.
Right, she's very popular at the base. I have to say, this was the only part of the story that didn't quite work for me, where Luke is this hero of the rebellion who destroyed the Death Star, and everyone turns on him very, very quickly.
Yeah, but I don't know. Isn't that life? I mean, aren't you only as good as your last sale? I don't know. To me, it felt very real, and it still does when I read it. And I think it's because of the Force. I think that, although we, the reader, obviously we know the Force is real, and we like Luke and stuff, and he's the hero, and we followed him. But I think, don't forget, there is, Han Solo is a classic example. There are people who are very distrustful of the Force and think it's a load of old mumbo jumbo, and there's that thing as well. And the Force has seemingly led him, this magical thing that some people really distrust, even within the rebellion, has led him astray, and he's killed this, as we think that she's innocent, and hugely popular sort of.
What you say makes sense. I guess I hadn't really thought about it like that.
There's also good old-fashioned resentment. Don't forget that Luke has come in to the rebellion in the events of the first Star Wars film, and he's blown up the Death Star, and he's this. He's who is he? He's some guy who's just come from sort of Tatooine or whatever. And I think it's very easy to see why there might be certain people just through sheer jealousy would, behind his back be a little bit like, oh, why has he got all the glory kind of thing? And the first opportunity they get, aha, he's made a mistake.
I get what you're saying. It's not that he's bigfooting them, but he's comes out of nowhere and he's the glory boy.
Right. To me, it feels very natural. And again, Michelini, we were saying about how he fleshes out these little tiny bit players, these little background characters. And I think there's a guy particularly called Milo, isn't there, in the
Yes.
in this thing, and he's really like, he's obviously really disliked Luke for a long time, and now he's really going to stick the knife in, and that, to me, that feels very three-dimensional. The rebellion are the sort of the good guys as we see them, as we experience Star Wars. They are the ones we root for them all to be lovely, nice people it's not realistic. And what I liked about this is that you get to see that suddenly, at the first instance, and
Even those people who supported him, they sort of have their hands tied.
they do, like Leia. She has her hands tied, really, because what can she say?
Leia does have her hands tied, or at least she feels like she has her hands tied, because all the evidence is against Luke. Everyone saw him shoot her down, and his explanation is basically like, magic told me to.
Yeah, right.
And
Exactly.
to your point, I think for a lot of people, there's probably, I haven't really thought about it, but there's probably still a lot of people that are distrustful of the Jedi in general, because now, now that we've had the backstory filled in, we know they kind of let everybody down. And there's also been this big smear campaign by the Empire against the Jedi for the last 25 years. But the only context that people now would really have for the Force is Vader, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
so yeah, I hadn't really thought about it when I was reading it, but what you say makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's just more evidence, really, of what a good writer Michelini is. He makes these. It's to me, it's very realistic. It's a sort of reaction I can imagine people having. Not everyone has that. A lot of people are really like, nah, it would never. It would never be. Luke would never do that. And then other people are like, well, come on. And it's very nuanced. And this is the thing, on a larger subject now, just talking about the whole series, some people badmouth the Marvel series. I think at its best, actually, it's very nuanced, and I think it deals with some complex issues, and this is sort of one of those. It's way more adult and nuanced than a lot of people give it credit for, I believe. And this is a classic example of that.
So at the end of this story, something happens that's also very important going forward, which is we discover that Shira Bree is not actually dead. She's only mostly dead, like Miracle Max would say. There's different levels of dead. And so Darth Vader has got her in this tube, and he's like, well, let's see what we can come up with. And that's not going to come up again for several years, but when it does come up again, it's going to be mostly cool and kind of disappointing, but mostly cool. But it becomes very important much, much later on in Joe Duffy's work.
That's it for this time around. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. As always, I'd like to thank my guest, the Confessor, and next time we'll have yet another part of our epic deep dive into Marvel's classic Star Wars series. Hope you'll join us for that, and I'll see you then.